Om Ajnanatimidandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Siddhantotpalasara Nitya Rasikam Hangsang Vilasatmakam Audaryakya Sudhama Sevakatanam Vishramba Bhakti Pradam Yatya Yukti Vichakshanam Twagabido Vaisishta Shaktya Sada Vandeham Tripurari Namakayutim Shri Bhakti Vedantinam Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadam Mahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gourangi Radhi Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye. Well, here we are doing part 2 of our Bhagavad-gita chapter 3 series. And so last time we went over the nature of action itself, and some detail actually, in how action influences the mind and how the mind influences the body. And we went into gave some examples from the modern scientific findings of exactly how that works in terms of how our beliefs, our belief system can influence our actual physiological changes in the body. Like I gave the example of some studies that had been done demonstrating how the beliefs about people's exercise changed the effects that that exercise had on their bodies without changing the amount of exercise they were doing. Or and another example I gave was by the same researchers, a milkshake study where the two different milkshakes, rather I should say, exactly identical milkshakes were given to a group of people at two different times, but they were told that they were different, and the measured effects that they had in their bodies based on what they thought was going on, what they thought they were ingesting, changed. So that was very interesting. So that was kind of the background for the nature of action and how it is that we are these embodied beings. Even though we are spiritual beings, we are embodied, and we have minds that are not physical, or at least not something we can touch and put our finger on, and yet somehow it influences the physical body, and the physical body likewise, like I said, influences the mind. So now building on that, today we'll actually start getting into the actual chapter itself, which is the overarching theme of this chapter, of course, is Nishkam Karma Yoga. That's the principal subject, and what exactly that is and how that differs from karma, ordinary karma. So as I pointed out in the last lecture, ordinary karma or action is just that. It's action of any kind, whether it be verbal or mental or physical. And then in order for an action to become yoga, it has to be done with a certain mentality. And this is an interesting point about Nishkam karma or karma yoga, is that it's what we do isn't really the point. it's the consciousness we do it in. So in Nishkam Karma Yoga, one is doing one's duty, whatever it is one does normally to maintain one's body and one's family if they have one or whatever. But then normally people in the conditioned state, they just act and they are trying to enjoy the fruits of their actions. They're acting in such a way, or they're acting with a mentality that they are the center and they are the enjoyer, and that everything they do is just for them, whether it's for them directly or whether it's for them in an extended form in terms of people and things that they identify with. So that's ordinary karma. So then karma yoga, excuse me, is karma yoga is what makes action a yoga, is moving one's consciousness in the direction of divinity. And at this point, Krishna is not overtly advocating for bhakti at all. He's speaking about Nishkam Karma Yoga in terms of its being a progressive stage of the soul's development from utter ignorance to ultimately to bhakti, which is Krishna's ultimate advocacy of the Gita. But here in the third chapter, he's not bringing that out at all. So Nishkam Karma Yoga is not bhakti. It may have some devotional elements to it, but it is not bhakti. And the reason it's not bhakti is that, like I said, you're basically doing what you would normally do, but you're doing it without a view to enjoy the fruits. Whereas bhakti is, the mentality is, we do what is favorable for bhakti and we reject that which is unfavorable with a view to please Bhagavan. So it's all about Krishna's pleasure or Bhagavan's pleasure in bhakti, whereas in karma yoga, you're doing what you have to do anyway. You're going to do it one way or the other just to be able to maintain your body. But you're distancing yourself from the fruits of it and trying to do it in a selfless way. So it's a huge, Nishkam Karma is a huge step up, huge measure of progress from just regular karma, but it's still a long way from bhakti. And so in the beginning of the opening, the chapter opens by Arjuna wondering, well, you wanted me to develop this equanimity of mind, and you've told me that knowledge is better than action, fruitive action. So why are you engaging me in this war, this horrible action? Kind of why are you engaging me in this action? Because any action is undertaken presumably for some result. So Krishna has a result that he wants to bring about by this, but what's the point? Arjuna's wondering, well, what's the point? So Krishna says there are two paths. See, at this point, again, he's not developing, the theology isn't there yet, and he's gradually making his case for bhakti. And in the beginning here, he's not letting much out about that. He says that there are two ways that the embodied souls can attain perfection. For the jnanis, it's through knowledge, and for the yogis, for the karma yogis, it's through action. And of the two, of course, action is better for beginners. And the reason for that, of course, is that by working with the body, it's much easier you get immediate feedback, and it's visible feedback. It's more easy to see what is happening with the body. Whereas the mind can be all over the place, and yet the person can be just sitting. And Krishna actually does address this in the opening section here of this chapter. But before we get to that, so the idea, just the nature of action is such, Krishna points out in the 9th verse, that all action in this world is binding unless it is performed as a sacrifice. And Satyanarayana Das Babaji translates this verse as, all endeavors other than those that are performed as an offering to Vishnu are the source of bondage in this world. So he brings out the theological implication of the verse, whereas Guru Maharaj's translation is, he doesn't mention Vishnu directly in the translation. But in either case, ultimately what the purifying agent within any action is doing it as an act of sacrifice. And then in that section, of course, Krishna goes on to lay out how in this world, through sacrifice, we satisfy the demigods satisfy us by thereby providing the material necessities it takes for us to live. But before Krishna gets there, he talks about the nature of action, and that it's that we can. He does mention that no matter what, we can't stop acting. The soul, as I pointed out in my first lecture, the soul is by nature is active. So in other words, consciousness is always, even in sleep, there is consciousness there. Consciousness is always active. It's always on, so to speak. Even in deep sleep, one could say that there are, and for ordinary people, of course, deep sleep is a state of unconsciousness. But the soul, it's not like the soul itself shuts off when we go to sleep. It's just that the soul is covered by the mind, so to speak, or covered by the gunas, tamas in particular, in that case. So then if the question may come, if all action binds the soul to the world, the source of bondage, what is that glue? What is that thing that binds the soul? How is a soul, an incorporeal, an immaterial being, bound to matter, the body? How is that possible? That's kind of one of those mysterious things, like, how does the mind influence the body, and how does the body influence the mind? And the answer, of course, is it's not through some physical mechanism, because that wouldn't make any sense. I mean, the soul is not physical, so it transcends matter. It doesn't exist within matter, and so matter can't bind the soul. It is the soul's identification with the gunas that binds it. So then Nishkam Karma Yoga is about gradually disidentifying with matter. So even though the Atma is not the focus in Nishkam Karma, one's actions are, but by doing one's actions with a view to having renounced, I should say, the desire to enjoy those actions and enjoy the fruit of those actions, then that requires some detachment. And it is this detachment that over time allows us to see through matter, as it were. Soul starts to actually come out. And that is the fruit of Nishkam Karma Yoga, is knowledge. So knowledge being, of course, not just worldly knowledge. Knowledge in this sense means realization of the Atma, realization that I am not the body, I am not the gunas, I am not anything of this world. I am a jiva, I am an Atma. That's the fruit of Nishkam Karma Yoga, the actual fruit of it. But Guru Maharaj mentions, as Krishna will gradually reveal in this chapter, while knowledge is the goal of the path of action, it must be attained through the path of action and not prematurely adopted through an intellectual sleight of hand. The solution to Arjuna's dilemma lies in understanding the secret of inaction within action, that is the heart of Karma Yoga, and ultimately in treading the path of devotion. So this gets to the nature of renunciation and true renunciation versus pseudo renunciation. So Krishna mentions that you can't just sit down. If you just sit down and adopt the external appearance of a renunciate, and yet the mind is still contemplating the object of the senses, then you're a pretender or a hypocrite. And so for one whose heart is not purified, the likelihood that that would happen is far, far greater than the likelihood that one would be able to actually sit and contemplate the nature of being with a peaceful mind, because the mind is the nature of the mind, the material mind acquired over countless births, is directed outward to the objects of the senses. And so to just decide one day that I'm going to turn inward, that's a good decision to make. But as we'll later on in the series, as we'll hear, habit does not work like that. There is a thing called the force of habit, or the habits have an inertia in a particular direction. And anybody who's ever decided that they want to lose weight knows what I'm talking about. Or they want to make a New Year's resolution to start going to the gym. And then when it actually, the day shows up that it's time to go to the gym, well, they've got other things to do, or there's so much internal resistance, and mental resistance, and bodily resistance. I can't get out of bed, or the mind says no, or whatever. Cake is more attractive than sweating in the gym. So that's the nature of habit. Habits exist for a reason. They exist to maintain homeostasis, a state of balance within the body, within the mental and physical system. But habits, as we know, can be both negative and positive, and some negative habits work against us, work against our better interests, our interests of what we know is better, what is good for us, and positive habits, of course, work for us. But in any case, in either case, good or bad, habits have inertia. And so this is why willpower has been proven to be ineffective in changing habits, because will is not enough. Our willpower runs out long before the inertia of the habit is overcome. But that's for later in the series. So the nature of Nishkam karma, though, or nature of renunciation, I should say, as we were discussing, is detachment comes about through action. And so over the years, I've given this a fair bit of thought, like, how does this work? Like, how does action bring about knowledge of the soul and detachment? And in other words, how does action train the mind, as is the title of this series, Training the Mind Through Action. So how does that work? It's a combination of things. It's a combination, I think, of tolerance and detachment, and of course, in practice, so repeated exposure. So dutiful, detached action trains the mind through tolerance, in the sense that anybody who's ever had a job knows what I'm talking about, which is you have to do things that you don't want to do when you don't want to do them. Your body has to be at work at a certain time every day, whether you want to or not. More often you would prefer not. And yet your body has to be there. And so the body, by getting up and going and doing that, forcing oneself to be there in those circumstances, because that's required for making a living. Gradually, over time, the mind starts to fall in line. So we start with the body. Same thing in like Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga. There's a reason that asana, after yama and niyama, the next one, after, so in other words, after one has a moral foundation for pursuing the path of yoga, they're a decent, and essentially a decent person to really start to ascend the ladder of yoga in Patanjali's yoga. You start with the body, with asana, then pranayama, the more subtle aspects of working with the mental energetic system. And only then, after some skill and steadiness of mind has been brought about through asana and pranayama, is one actually able to really abstract the mind, withdraw the mind in pratyahar, from withdrawing the mind from the sense objects. And then that is the beginnings of the contemplative life, pratyahar, and then actual dharana, concentration. So if one looked at the path of yoga, and they see that, well, okay, so samadhi is how we actually purify the mind and heart. So I'll just practice samadhi. Good luck. It's not so easy. Samadhi is something that is attained with only through having a steady mind. And so a steady mind is attained by first steadying the body. So that's the idea of asana. Asana is defined by Patanjali as sukham and stiram. Sukham meaning it's pleasant. It's not, you're not pushing to the point of pain. Some challenge may be there, but not pain. And stiram, it's steady. So steadiness of the body leads to steadiness of the mind. And this is also can be reflected in the in dhyan, meditation itself. Like in the Vedanta Sutra, meditation is said to only properly be possible in seated positions. And in the 6th chapter of the Gita, Krishna lays out the whole process of how to sit properly. So when the trunk and the neck and the head are in a straight line, one sits on a seat that is on a kusha grass mat with a deer skin and the cloth, and not too high, not too low. He gives all these parameters for sitting properly. And then the idea is you sit and you sit still and you turn within, so that by taking the body out of the equation, one can focus the mind. But this presupposes that one has the ability to actually sit still. And so when I was practicing, I took the teacher's training in the early 90s with Shivananda, they said there's two kinds of asanas. There are cultural asanas and there are actual meditation asanas. And the meditation asanas are just a few, Siddhasana, Padmasana, like that. And then the cultural asanas are there and are practiced for one reason only, and that is to give the body, to train the body to be able to sit for extended periods of time so that you can meditate. That's the classical view of it. And it's not to make the body pretty or attractive to the opposite sex or any of that. It's to be able to sit and meditate. That's what asana is for. So now in the context of bhakti, well, let's say, so we're training the mind through going to a job is one thing. How about another example might be in the bhakti, in our tradition, would be, let's say you join the ashram. So you're doing your duty. Rise early and bathe and do the sadhana or service that is prescribed by the guru. So for most of us, this is not pleasant. Getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, 7 days a week is, for most people, until you're habituated to it, it's just extremely difficult. And there is going to be some resistance to that, at the very least mentally. So your body may be getting up in the morning and going to Mangalarti or whatnot, and may be there, but the mind may be going, oh, I'd much rather be in bed right now. But you're there anyway. And eventually, gradually, as you do that daily, day in and day out, the mind starts to come around, and the qualities of tamas are overcome gradually, and some sattva, ingress of sattva is there, and you actually start to like it. You start to start to understand the point of why I'm doing this. Oh, getting up in the morning is doing something for me. But it's that tolerance, tolerating being there, or doing something that you don't want to be doing at a time you don't want to be doing it. That leads to some detachment. So you're, in other words, the mind may be going on about how it doesn't want to be doing what the body is engaged in, and yet you're doing it anyway. And so some detachment has to be there. You start to detach oneself from the dictates of the mind and the senses. The sense of feeling, I guess, would be just wants you to remain on the pillow. And yet, no, that's not what we're doing here. We're doing sadhana. So you get up and you drag yourself out of bed and you go. And so these patterns of habit, which are basically governing our lives, are gradually changed. They're replaced with a different pattern. And people who have been in the ashram for a long time may notice that even once they leave the ashram, that even if they were never a morning person to begin with, before they join the ashram, after being there for a while and having done that program, if they leave the ashram, they still get up early just because that's what they're used to. So habits have power. And that is the one of the overarching messages that I want to bring out and work with, explore in this series, is just habits, the power of habit. Everybody knows the power of habit. More often than not, the power of negative habits, but we're going to go into positive habits too, and that's what sadhana. Sadhana is a series, or a cluster of positive habits. So renunciation. Renunciation is then, Krishna says, you can't just sitting down and acting like renunciate is not actual renunciation. Renunciation, or the ability to sit and be contemplative, comes about through action. And that is so true renunciation is actually doing whatever you need to do, whether it's inconvenient for your body or not, but doing it with detachment. So presumably there, if Krishna is mentioning it, there obviously were people who would get the theory, they'd understand that, dutiful action, doing my duty, that's problematic. There's so much work involved in that. And so I'm not my body anyway, so why bother? I'm not going to do that. I'll just become a renunciate, and I'll sit down on this mat and I will practice yoga. But as we know, more often than not, that doesn't actually work. What ends up usually happening is that the person will end up contemplating the things that are the desires that cause people to move in the world have not been removed from the heart. And so just sitting down doesn't rid oneself of those desires, and those desires will still force the mind to act in those habitual grooves regardless. And so one will then be a hypocrite because you might have adopted the garb of a sannyasi or whatever and be sitting on the cushion and meditating, when in fact you're just contemplating the things that you used to be involved in. And so Krishna condemns this as this is not good. And this is just in the broad spiritual practitioner, the broad spirituality in the broadest brush, painted with the broadest brush. Whereas in bhakti in particular, we've all heard many times, I'm sure, of the reality that we can't just sit and chant, pick up a Joppa mala and sit all day and night like Haridas Thakur and chant Joppa. Therefore, beginners are never, at least in our tradition, in the Bhakti Vinod Parivar and Saraswat Sampradaya in particular, beginners are never encouraged to just sit and chant on their beads, because the practical observation has been that does not work. That people who try to do that generally end up not doing it for very long, and then they generally end up, if not falling away from the path of bhakti altogether, they fall away from that pseudo-renounced position and end up absorbed in all sorts of sensuality, often is the case. And so rather than emphasizing japa or nirjan bhajan, sitting alone and chanting, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has recommended Kirtan. And so why is that? Well, it should be pretty obvious that Kirtan engages the body more than japa. In Kirtan, you've got to, first of all, you've got the social pressure, as it were, or the social dynamic where you actually enter a room with other people at the same time. So you got to be there. And if you're not there, then people might look around and wonder where you're at. So there's that. It engages your body just by being there. And there's so many elements to it. If there's the musical elements of the melody and the rhythm, and so that takes a certain amount of attention and intelligence to be able to focus on those things. And then If you're standing up, there could be dancing as well. So like the body and the intellect are engaged much more fully. Whereas in Joppa, the idea is that the body is your consciousness has been cultivated to such a degree that you can live within the realm of consciousness itself and forget about the body. That's actual bhajan, is when you can forget about the body and go within and focus on doing lila seva through chanting the name. And so it should be fairly obvious that not just anybody, not a beginning sadhakas, they have no business attempting to do that. And so they are recommended do kirtan, do things like archan. And of course, over time, we'll start to realize that these physical practices have non-physical aspects to them. Like, for example, if you're doing puja to a deity, one of the an important aspect of doing the puja is to first offer the articles within the mind. And it's said that for sadhakas, then if one doesn't do that, then the actual offering the articles externally they will not bear fruit. So that's just a way of saying that the mind has to be engaged as well as the body. But the body, you're going collecting all these articles, and the articles have to be of a certain type, and the paraphernalia has to be clean and polished and whatnot, and following all these rules. It's very engaging, it's very absorbing, and that is the point. So the body is, by forcing the body to go through these motions, you start to actually rein the mind in and focus it on Krishna, and then gradually bring it in the direction of going within into the Leela ultimately. So that, of course, that's the very, very high end of training the mind through action. And it's far, far beyond karma yoga, but the principles, of course, of karma yoga are still, excuse me, they're still the same. They still apply within the realm of bhakti. So then one could say that just as knowledge, atmagyan, knowledge is the fruit of nishkam karma. In other words, the ability to contemplate the nature of the Atma is the fruit of having acted in a detached and selfless manner. In bhakti, by doing kirtan, the fruit of that is contemplative life, the ability to sit and chant. So there's a parallel there. And of course, the ability to sit and chant means that the principal anarthas have been cleared from the heart. So we're talking about the stage of nishta, and even more so ruchi, is when one can actually sit with a peaceful mind, focused mind, a steady mind. Nishta means steadiness, so steady. Nishta in the full sense of the word means steadiness, steady mind, not just, you get up every day and do the temple program, that's great, but that isn't necessarily the stage of nishta. That's the actual stage of nishta. This means that the mind has been, the chitta has been purified of the major aspects of worldliness that infest the heart of most conditioned souls. And then one can actually sit, even though nishta is described as, if you have a box that had camphor in it and you take all the camphor out, there's still some scent. So nishta, of course, there's still material desire there, but they're subtle, and they're subtle enough that they do not stand in the way of one's practice. And so at that stage, one can sit and chant peacefully and the more subtle practice like that will actually bear fruit. Whereas prior to that, if one has all sorts of desires that are drawing the mind outward all the time, chanting will be less efficacious, because for the simple fact that you can't pay attention to the name. Whereas in Kirtan, oh, it's a beautiful melody. It's so attractive, so beautiful. It just makes you want to chant forever. That's great. That means you're paying attention. And then, but usually what happens in Kirtan even is that even though it is so absorbing, still it's not like you're chanting the same melody for hours and hours and hours. Usually what happens is you chant for a while, and then the mind starts to get bored of that, and you stop, and then you chant a different melody for a while. And that there is in this modern psychology, Western psychology, there is a recognition of the effect of novelty on learning and on training the body and different aspects. So the novelty is how the mind, how the brain has evolved to work. It thrives on novelty. And so a certain degree of novelty within an overall structure of sameness is very, very effective. And what I mean by that is, say, if you've got a program of sadhana where you do the same things every day, you do Joppa, you do Kirtan, you do Archan, you do Puja, you do Seva, but there's enough variety, enough novelty, as it were, within those things to keep the mind occupied. Or let's say you're doing Kirtan for a while, and then you do Kirtan for a bit, and then the mind starts to tell you, well, okay, that's enough of that. And then, okay, you move on to, say, reading. And then your mind starts to lose focus, and then you move on to something else, and then something else. So that's a very effective way to bring about steadiness, because you're continually engaged in bhakti, but it's just in different forms. And so there's enough novelty, but not so much that it's just all over the place. So needs to be a balance between novelty, too much novelty where it's just absolute chaos and you don't know what to expect, and then too much routine where it's just boring. A good balance between the two. And that is an excellent method of training the mind. And we find that is exactly what is happening in sadhana. That we know what to expect, and in terms of the general flow of things, but there's enough variety there that hopefully we don't get too we don't just go through the motions and stop paying attention to what we're doing. That's the idea, that these different limbs of sadhana are there, so that we could look at it from this perspective that I'm talking about, this novelty perspective that could be looked at. The reason these different practices, Navalakshan Bhakti, or the different 64 limbs of Bhakti, are there just so that we can find different methods, whatever happens to work at the moment. If the mind is not engaged by one, try something else. If that doesn't work, try something else. And if that doesn't work, try something else. So if if reading doesn't work, put the book down and do Kirtan. If Kirtan doesn't work, put the kartals and drum down and do something else, like sit and do prayer, or whatever it is. In other words, in sadhana, we try to find a way to stay engaged. Now, of course, in a modern life where we have to go out into the world and make a living and whatnot, that's much harder to do. And so I think that kind of comes down to going back to the idea of doing what we do as a sacrifice, uh, as a sacrifice for Vishnu. So thinking I'm going to this job, doing whatever it is, going to my job to maintain my body, but I'm maintaining my body so that I can do sadhana, because I identify as a sadhaka. So, as I said earlier, what binds the soul to the gunas is our identification with them. What frees the soul from the gunas is our disidentification with them. In other words, our identification with something else. So our identification as a sadhaka, as a bhakta, as a Vaishnava, our identification as a servant of Krishna, das anudas. Servants of Krishna, because Krishna is non-material. His servants are also not of the gunas. So by identifying with that, identifying oneself as a sadhaka is not a material being. So the more we can identify like that, even though we are working in the world and interacting with people and sense objects and whatnot, due to our identification, rather than that action being binding, that action will be liberating. It's very subtle, and it takes time. Obviously, it's not something that, it's kind of like if you have a disease and you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you a prescription. Just because you've got the prescription in hand doesn't mean that you're suddenly cured of the disease. It takes time and it takes consistency. But with time and consistency, we gradually start to see that our consciousness changes. We lose interest in things that used to consume us. And things that we never had interest in before suddenly become, or gradually become, one or the other. They become of interest to us and hold our attention with great power. So, and we find that almost without effort, our consciousness is drawn internally. And the tendency of the mind to be continually going outward, that flow is reversed. But again, this is on a microscopic as opposed to macroscopic level. So on the macroscopic level, the overall duty or the overall task of the sadhaka is to turn one's consciousness within permanently. But we can't do that because we have duties. In order to maintain our body, we need to work, and that requires our consciousness to be directed outward into the world, to sense objects. But in sadhana, on a microscopic level, I should say, we are a little bit every day encouraged to turn within and do some joppa, let's say, practice contemplative life until we get to the stage where we can actually live there. And then in nishkam karma, one will just do one's duty, and then one will keep on doing one's duty, and it doesn't really matter. One will be detached, but they'll keep doing their duty because that's what you got to do. Whereas at a certain point in bhakti, if you see that, for example, a particular job or a particular life circumstance it might be favorable at a certain stage of bhakti, and then as your heart is purified, you can see that you start to have more of a desire to practice, and then those life circumstances are no longer favorable. So then those life circumstances will be changed in order to be a progressive sadhaka. One would need to move in the direction of the internal call, the pull that is being that we're recognizing from, that is the fruit of the sadhana. So by doing our practice over time, just like as we become more eligible for contemplative life, then as Bhaktivinoda mentions, we need to move in the direction of that, not just stay put. I mean, if we're genuinely moving in the direction of contemplative life, and we, out of social convention, remain in a situation that's not going to be favorable, that's actually going to work against us in the long run. But that usually comes fair bit later in life. And then you can see, therefore, the recommendation of the ashram system, the classical ashram system. There's wisdom in that one would not attempt, generally speaking, to take up the renounced order of life until the very last stage of life, where one's gone through all these other things and those desires have been fulfilled by having been there and done that, and at least hopefully not interested anymore through having done the practice, and through having been purified through acting with the body, such that the mind gradually becomes trained. So that's all I have for today. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. Well, doesn't look like it, so I wish everyone a great day. Until next time.